Rozina, you were in New York for the debate. Just take us there. And what was the atmosphere like, particularly through the debate and then afterwards?
Well, Kamal, I was in the spin room before and after the debate, and the mood was very different at both of those points in time. Ahead of time, as is typical for these events, you had surrogates for both campaigns out doing a bit of strategic messaging, trying to manage expectations. We'd heard from Democrats before the debate that they were nervous about Tim Walz's abilities. He's professed himself to be a bad debater. It was something that he raised with Kamala Harris when she was vetting him to be her running mate. So clearly he was aware that that was a potential liability for him. And Democrats were very candid ahead of the debate about their nerves, about their concerns about his potential performance. The Republicans in the spin room were very much, quietly confident. They didn't want to say it too much, but, JD Vance is an Ivy League educated lawyer. His wife is also a graduate of Yale Law School. She's reportedly been helping him prepare for last night. So they were confident in JD Vance's abilities, but they didn't want to say that, too loudly ahead of time. Afterwards, it was a very different mood in the spin room. The Trump campaign surrogates were quite literally taking a victory lap as they walked among the reporters, talking about just how much they felt JD Vance had dominated the night. We heard from Donald Trump's eldest son. He was there in person. He's a close friend of JD Vance. That's Donald Trump Jr. He was grinning from ear to ear. And, the language that he used was very much JD had dominated, that he'd wiped the floor with Tim Walz. I also spoke to Jason Miller, who is a senior aide to Donald Trump's campaign. He actually took a different tone. The language that he used was, we saw JD Vance as a likable guy, which was quite different to the JD Vance we're used to seeing. And that was really something that the Trump campaign were eager to show undecided voters, who the group that they really need to win over in this White House race. It was a softer form of Trumpism. It was a softer form of the MAGA brand, and they felt that they'd done what they needed to do.
Rozina, do you think that shows that, or will that continue? Do you think it was because of the peculiar tests of the VP debate, or do you think that the Republicans, and particularly Donald Trump and JD Vance, have thought we have to show a softer side in some way, and that's what's going to possibly move the swing voters? So will it last?
It's always hard to know with Donald Trump and his discipline on when it comes to messaging, how much that will last. But certainly JD Vance knew that he needed to show that softer, less pugilistic side of himself. He's often referred to as Donald Trump's attack dog, and what he needed to do last night was come across as empathetic. He's made a few missteps. He's made some contentious remarks that have come back to bite him. He's talked about childless cat ladies, something that's really upsets a lot of people. And obviously Donald Trump's campaign does have a woman problem at the moment. There are suburban women in America who could decide this race that the campaign really needs to win over. So last night, he talked about abortion in a much more conciliatory way. He conceded that actually his approach was not one that voters in his home state of Ohio necessarily shared, and he talked about earning back the trust of Americans on that issue. So certainly we might expect to see more of that from JD Vance. Obviously, the debate stage is a very different forum to, a campaign rally, so it remains to be seen whether that message carries through into the campaign events. But for the millions of people watching at home who might tune into primetime TV but not to those rallies, it was certainly a message that will have resonated.
And the most awkward moment seemed to me to be when Tim Walz was caught out, I suppose you'd say, about was he at the Tiananmen Square demonstrations through that period in China's history? He had said in the past that he was. And just take us through, he came unstuck, didn't he, around that issue?
Yeah, and that was actually a very surprising moment because that was a question that Tim Walz and the people preparing him really should have expected. This is just the latest instance of Tim Walz admitting to misspeaking or being questioned over some of his claims about his biography. Previously, when talking about his military record, he's talked about guns he used in war. It then emerged that he's never seen active combat. He talked about the fertility struggles that he and his wife had been through and talked about undergoing IVF. His wife later came out and said actually they'd used a much less invasive fertility treatment. So the latest, as you say, was his past comments on being in Hong Kong, in the region around the time of Tiananmen Square. In fact, he was there after the massacre had occurred. His answer last night was really quite unsatisfactory. He said, well, I'm a bit of a knucklehead and I'm essentially, it was another version of I misspoke, but he flubbed his lines. It wasn't a polished response, and it felt quite unsatisfactory, actually.
How are the polls looking, Rozina? Kamala Harris obviously had some momentum when obviously Joe Biden dropped out of the race. Will this affect either side to any great degree? I think the point about inexperience, what Tim Walz revealed, as you suggest, was inexperienced, didn't know how to respond to really quite straightforward questions. And JD Vance showed a bit of a different tone. Will that help the Republicans regain momentum?
Well, historically, vice presidential candidates and the debates that they have don't, really move the needle. In a race that is as tight as this one, the polls are pretty much deadlocked between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. It may have had some influence. We'll have to wait and see what the polling in the next few days shows. But there are major events happening in the US and the wider world right now that will really have an impact on this race. I'm thinking about the thousands of American dock workers who are currently striking, and even if that's a short-term strike, that could have a major impact on the US economy, a major impact on Kamala Harris, and of course the conflict in the Middle East. That really adds to the way people view Joe Biden's foreign policy legacy. It also has the practical impact of drawing Harris away from the campaign trail. She's, in Washington yesterday in the White House in these security briefings. That's physically taking her off the campaign trail. But as you say, she has had a lot of momentum. She continues to raise a phenomenal amount of money. I don't see this particular debate necessarily changing the dynamics of the race too much at this stage, though.
And Rozina, just finally, do crises abroad affect how people think about the two sides in this battle in America? Because Donald Trump obviously can lean in to his oft-stated claim that no wars started whilst he was in power. And I'm the hard man of the world who can sort out all conflict. Does what's happening in the Middle East and the horrific things that we have seen mean that the public look at Trump slightly more warmly and think it is time for someone like that?
I think, when you look at the polls, the issues that voters list as their top concerns, they're things like the cost of living and immigration. So wars overseas don't necessarily have a big impact on how they're feeling day to day. What they do have an impact on, though, is the narrative spun by these two campaigns. Kamala Harris and the Democrats have attempted to cast Donald Trump as this agent of chaos and, promoted a message of stability and security. That's really undercut by what we're seeing at the moment. And it's very hard to keep that message on track and make that sound legitimate when, as JD Vance pointed out last night, this has happened under the Biden-Harris administration. And actually, that was a very effective line of attack probably one that the Trump campaign, which Donald Trump himself had hit in his own debates, and one that actually probably will resonate with voters.
Rozina Sabur, our Deputy US Editor, thanks so much for joining us from New York.
Thank you.